Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. Hello everyone, as you can tell my voice is still messed up after the EUIC. I did have a great time, but I did have to leave early on the Sunday because I really wasn't feeling all that well, couldn't really talk, and I'm still slowly getting my voice back. But I'm super excited to talk about the EUIC. It was a fantastic event, the largest outside of Japan, which is incredible, especially for a European tournament. And it was our first event post-rotation, so many things going on. We're going to talk about the entire breakdown, and I know that Orlando is this weekend, so I did want to, despite my voice, get my thoughts out there. So let's start off with the day one field, where the most popular deck by far was Charizard at almost 23%, which is really a huge metagame share. Not incredibly surprising, certainly that Charizard was the most popular deck, but it was miles ahead of most other choices out there. And this is because it had done the best in Japanese tournaments as well as online tournaments for the Western world. And a lot of people see it as a safe pick. I'm sure there'd be a number of players already comfortable with Charizard from the previous format, not making too many adjustments, just throwing in new A-spec cards, sticking with that very powerful engine makes it one of the key contenders in format, and that's represented with that huge nod of players playing it in day one. Chien-Pao was then the next most popular deck at almost 13%, with then Lugia being the third most popular. I was expecting a little bit more Lugia than actually turned out on the day. There is still some cynicism around the archetype's consistency, and we will also see that towards the higher stages of the tournament, that there weren't that many Archeops. It did do well in some of the other age divisions, but in the Masters division, where there's just so many rounds, it's difficult to justify an archetype that has these consistency issues, even though it's really solid into Charizard and some of the other archetypes out there. Then we have Arceus Giratina at almost 8%. This is the archetype that I chose to play going into the tournament. It does feel like it's relatively favoured into Charizard and has play into Chien-Pao. Doesn't really enjoy the Lugia matchup, but is quite good against the things sort of below it as well. Certainly it's good against the Future Hands deck, which showed up quite well, actually. It was very popular in the online tournaments a few weeks ahead of the EUIC. And a lot of people did pull the trigger on the archetype overall, possibly trying to cash in on the amount of potential Lugia that was expected. It's also pretty okay into the Chien-Pao matchup. And in general, it is the low-to-the-ground aggressive deck of the format, which already has a huge wave of people wanting to play as well. I think going into the next few tournaments, because Future Hands had such a good conversion, and because Roaring Moon actually picked up, I think those are going to be vying for contention as that very fast, aggressive, basic attacking archetype. Those are the kind of two options that we have right now. The upside of the Iron Hands Crown deck, of course, is that you can uptrade in so many ways, thanks to hitting for crucial weaknesses into Lugia and Pidgeot, as well as having the Amp You Very Much potential into single prize Pokemon, which is phenomenal. And as we know, Miraidon is such a fantastic single prize attacking threat that is difficult to get around. So we will have a lot of Future Hands talk today, because it did have a really, really good tournament, even as the fifth most popular deck in day one. And then Lost Zone Giratina, a lot less popular, obviously, post-rotation, but again, very easy to justify archetype, where again, it's pretty good into Charizard. It had something to figure out in terms of that Chien-Pao matchup being really awkward. Also, many people were likely teching for Lugia by choosing to play a Temple of Sinnoh, I would imagine, to sort of justify their pick of this deck, because, as we know, has a good engine behind it and still has very powerful attacking threats. Then we move on to the sort of best of the rest. Snorlax didn't quite make it onto the graphic. I was actually expecting a higher percentage of Snorlax, possibly because there's a number of people choosing to play the Pidgeot control as well, which is labeled other control for some reason. Maybe there were some other builds. Maybe there's a wacky, like, barrel Squovit style control deck. I know that was something Sander was trying to cook as well pre-EUIC. I would imagine it's mostly Pidgeot control, though. But yeah, Snorlax, obviously this sort of dodge and weave archetype. If we go back to the sort of day one analysis, you're in theory trying to be good into Charizard Chien-Pao. You're not good into Lugia or Arctina. You're, depending on the list, good into Future Box. It depends if they're choosing to tech all these switching cards or not. And the Tina isn't that favoured either. So really is trying to have a good day in terms of what matchups you're trying to hit. I feel like the Pidgeot control is kind of more flexible of the two, where you have more proactive answers in your toolkit compared to Snorlax, which is much more passive, still trying to use the Eerie now, but also the Misfortune Sisters as your crucial means of disrupting the opponent. Then we have Lost Zone Box, mostly with Roaring Moon EX, oftentimes also going to have Iron Hands in there as well, of course. That sort of Paradox Box really falling off in play rates for how good this was in the Japanese format, and also how overperforming it was for its play rate in the online events. I'm really stunned at how few people pulled the trigger on Lost Zone Box. That is to say that Lost Zone Box is typically a better archetype once the format is established. Once we know what we need to be countering as a Lost Box deck, then it can sort of find its footing and lean back into that engine that little bit more. There were some high placing Lost Boxes, despite the lack of popularity day one. So it's definitely something I expect to be picking up in play rate once again. Ancient Box did have a reasonable representation, and also Gardevoir, obviously hugely off the map with the amount of losses that it had from the rotation, but another archetype I think that will be picking up steam in the next couple of weeks based on this tournament performance at the EUIC, where some not only high profile players, but also some really high placements with the deck, which is cool. And there's still those Goldengo stands out there trying to make it rain with this guy rather than playing just standard Chien-Pao. I suppose it's for those players who don't like playing candy style decks. So as we move into day two, then Charizard slightly underperformed, but that's to be expected as the most popular deck in the room. And I'm certain most players will have a game plan into Charizard because of just its well-known quantity and the fact that many expected it to be the most popular deck and actually was. And of course, with that much popularity, there's going to be Charizards knocking out Charizards, that sort of thing. So overall, it did fine. Chien-Pao's conversion was pretty decent. Lugia's wasn't great. Iron Hands and Lost Giratina both doing quite well. And Art Giratina not really having a disgraceful showing, but also not doing all that great, with 18 of them making it into day two. Myself among them, playing a very straightforward list. So then, before we look at the deck lists in detail, we do have a snapshot of our top 8 decks and players. We have 2 future hands crown decks. We have Ufei as well as Yuho, who is already an international championship winner with Miraidon, of course, so is very accustomed to Ampu very much and has now found the new means of playing an aggressive Iron Hands variant. We have 2 Charizard Pidgeots. One of them is TORD Reklev, who now, after the EUIC, is a 5-time international champion. And also, just to put that into even further context, of the 22 international championships, TORD has top 8'd or better 11 of them, and has made the final of 7 of them, and then won 5. It's really not even a hot take anymore to call TORD the best player of all time, and he's continuing to impress at every single tournament. William, also a really well-respected Charizard player. William was actually part of the innovation of the Arvanzard in the first place, and in his own right is a 4-time regional champion, and has previously got a top 4 at an Internats. We have Mark Hostrup with a Roaring Moon Dunsparce archetype, which I think is really interesting. Predominantly, it is going to be the one-prize Roaring Moon, but it does also play the multi-prizer to gouge through high hit point Pokemon, with that new single prize to Dunsparce as a pivot in the deck, as well as a draw engine. This really picked up steam over the last couple of weeks in online tournament play, so really cool to see that not only Mark, but a few other players decided to pilot this archetype at such a high-profile tournament and have such great results with it. We then have Isaiah, again, one of America's finest, piloting Giratina Lost Zone. Had been doing so in the previous format. Looks like they've created the right adaptations to make it competitive once again in this format. And Isaiah played some really interesting tech cards that we will get onto in a moment. Isaiah already making the finals of NEIC, now getting a second finalist under his belt. You've got to feel bad for Isaiah. He's hit 2 international finals, and in those finals he's had to play TORD and Azul. Isaiah really is coming up against the final boss in each of these tournaments. And then to round out the top 8, we have Alessandro and Bert. They're actually both playing Pidgeot control variants. I think because Bert was playing 3 copies of Snorlax in his list, it got quantified as Snorlax control, but it did play a Pidgeot EX line in there. So it does seem like the Pidgeot control build was the right call for this tournament. Bert, a teammate of mine, obviously in close contact with Sander, and has been testing this archetype for a decent chunk of time, and somehow managed to beat a Lugia on the winning, which is really kind of unexpected, I would say. And then Alessandro Cremascoli, I'm sure most of you are already aware that he really is this sort of control, stall, denial extraordinaire, has been piloting these sorts of archetypes for many years consecutively now in pretty much every format that he can get his hands on an archetype like this. So it's no surprise to see someone so accomplished with this style of archetype do so well. I'm going to take a look at his list in detail, but also he has his own YouTube channel. It is Italian speaking, but he has done a huge wall of text here in tweaks around the list itself, and has basically done a Q&A entirely on the deck list. So congrats to them on the result, and if you want to hear their thoughts on the archetype, you can see that in their chain of tweets below, which I will be linking in the description. Moving into the deck list then, and we'll start with the 5-time international champion TORD Reklev, piloting Charizard Pidgeot that also has that 1/1 Bibarel line. It's interesting that in the previous format, TORD actually played a really wonky Charizard list that also incorporated Urshifu VMAX, obviously pre-rotation, that played Pidgeot and Bibarel. So sort of stealing that concept for this new format is a really interesting sort of engine test that he'd been able to construct, giving yourself that nice backup option of Bibarel in matchups where Pidgeot is going to be targeted or not allowed to be put into play for certain prize race issues, or to give you some safeguard around TM devolution. We saw multiple times TORD was on stream and was utilizing this Bibarel in order to maintain an entirely single prize board state to allow your Charizard to be much more of a checkmate card rather than just a tempo one prize attacker. TORD also chose to incorporate the Cleffer in his deck. Cleffer is a Buddy Poffin searchable alternative to Rotom if you do have access to Fire Energy in your opening hands to retreat into this card and use that Grasping draw to get yourself up to 7 cards. This safeguards you around the Spiritomb Tech card, which was being talked about in the build-up to the EUIC. It's an additional free retreat pivot, which could be fantastic for your Prime Catcher as well as your Radiant Charizard combo in the late game. And it's leaving a single prize Pokemon on the field compared to Rotom, which can easily be picked off by certain archetypes, to try and bait the opponent into taking that single prize knockout, which oftentimes helps Charizard Pidgeot's prize map overall. Trying to keep them on that odd prize map can really be beneficial to the Charizard players. The other main innovation that TORD brought to the archetype was respect for control and Snorlax in general, and that was by incorporating 2 copies of Professor Churro's scenario as well as the Team Yell's Cheer supporter, allowing you to shuffle 3 in any combination of Pokemon and supporter cards back into your deck. Giving you more uses of Boss's Orders and Professor Churro just allows you to maintain a chain of attackers more effectively, whereas previously we'd seen many Charizard builds basically sack the matchup by just playing one Churro and nothing else. TORD wasn't the only player to do this, actually. A number of the Australian contingent, and I know a number of the Shuffle Squad members, decided to play a mini control style package in their Charizard deck to respect the controlling options. Definitely seems like a metagame call because you are committing quite a number of spaces into your deck for this matchup, but now that it is a known quantity, it does make Snorlax and Pidgeot control much more of a risky play, I would say. So that's something we really need to keep an eye on. Unlike most other Pidgeot builds of Charizard, because there is that 1/1 line Bibarel in parts, we see Prime Catcher coming into the deck list instead, with TORD trying to make up for the damage loss with Choice Belt and Defiance both landing in the list. It's actually kind of nice that because you are dropping down a copy of Boss's Orders, you're also sort of stealing that space back by having a Prime and counter in the list anyway, so that Arven can also cherry pick this card when it's required. Despite losing a number of Nest Ball in the deck list, a lot of these spaces have been committed to basically other consistency cards in the Cleffer and the Bidoof line anyway. So in a roundabout way, this still is a very, very consistent 60. I've already had a play around with it and I do really enjoy maintaining single prize board states. And at the end of the day, the best player in the world piloted this archetype, went undefeated with the deck, so that's a real good nod to its power. Quickly jumping down to the top 4 list from William, he played a few different cards in the deck list, who also decided to play Cleffer, which is a really good sign for the tech card that is shown up in both top 8 lists. A slightly different supporter line from William, as well as a Pal Pad coming into the deck list, so you do have potential reuse of Churro and Boss's Orders, but also an Eerie, which can be good for mirror matches, Chien-Pao, and every now and then it's still going to be good against control, because you can try and snipe counter catches against the opponent. I think the key difference between TORD and William's list is that he went heavy into the Devo package here, trying to give him a better time in the mirror match and possibly to improve your Chien-Pao matchup. So I would expect also a number of players to take on this deck list if they are expecting a lot of Charizard in the next coming weeks. The main card I kind of disagree with in the 60 after seeing TORD go all the way down to 1 Nest Ball, and especially because Cleffer's already in the 60, I'd love to see a flip-flop of Nest Ball to the 4th Buddy Poffin, because that's still an essential card for your early game setup. Jumping back up to 2nd place, we have Isaiah's Giratina list, and it's pretty wacky because it's incorporated a 2/1/1 line of Banette. The single prize Banette can grab a supporter from our discard pile, put it directly into our hand, and throw the Banette itself into the lost zone. This can, in a low-key way, ramp your lost zone, and gives you a little bit of extra consistency because we have 2 essentially additional outs to guaranteeing a supporter card, and it can be a Pokemon that you leave in play to give yourself protection against Roxanne or Iono. But the main reason the Banette line is in the list whatsoever is that the Banette EX can flip some quite awkward matchups. Gaining this Everlasting Darkness option is fantastic against the Chien-Pao matchup, which on paper was Giratina's worst matchup. So there's no doubt that Isaiah wanted to flip the script and give himself a better time in this scenario. Item locking opponents early can cheese them out of rare candies altogether, or simply finding spots where you can trap a Pokemon in the active position for a number of turns with Everlasting Darkness can set up potential Sableye plays to take multi-prize knockouts on Chien-Pao Tempower's engine Pokemon in one turn. At the same time, we happened to see Poltergeist do a huge amount on stream as well when he came up against the Pidgeot control, which I suppose is another nice bonus for the deck. In order to fit in the 2-1-1 Banette line, we have had to go a little bit skimpy on the supporters. Sometimes in the previous format you would see an extra Roxanne and an extra copy of Boss, but remember we can recover these with our Brunette anyway. There's also no water energy in the deck list whatsoever, so the Greninja is simply a draw engine, and other than that it's trying to bait out Manaphy from opponents and waste the board space for them. There's still that respect being shown to the Lugia players with a Temple of Sinnoh in the list, as well as an Artisan, which I think is another nod to controlling players, allowing you to unlock yourself from opponents' Temple of Sinnoh so that you can keep your jet energies live. Isaiah also chose to adopt the Forest Seal Stone in the deck list, something that we did see over in Japan in this format, and it seems like there's enough matchups where you don't require Style Requiem where we can take use of this V-Star power. As we know, Bradner is very experienced with this archetype and is one of the best players in the US, so it wouldn't surprise me if players decided to strip the Banette back out of the list, similar to Azul's top 1660 instead, especially with Chen Pao not quite making it into any of the top 8s. There could be an argument for stealing that space back and putting it into more traditional counts. But for this tournament, with Chen Pao being the second most played archetype, it seemed like a very strong call. Getting into some Pidgeot control then, once again, in the description it's going to be Alessandro talking specifically about his deck list, so I'm only going to touch on this briefly, where, as we know, you have a lot of attacking options in this type of controlling archetype. Luxray is attempting to Fang Snipe key trainer cards out of the opponent's hand early on with double turbo energy. We have Chi-Yu, which can proactively mill the opponent. Noivern EX, especially with Thornton in the deck list, is going to be your means around basic attacking matchups like Future Hands and Lost Zone Box. Alessandro chose to play no copies of Snorlax, but does still have the tempting trap option from Morwell in the deck list. And Radiant Charizard is kind of that catch-all, aggressive attacking option where you can either use a Hero's Cape against low damage output matchups or Defiance Band to reach into V-Stars to KO them. So make no mistake, this deck has multiple win conditions and it will look to prize race opponents. When you get down to the nitty-gritty, you can Iono and spam your Radiant Charizard, knowing that Pidgeot can search out crucial cards in the late game. There's still so many options within this deck list. We have Eerie, we have Silene, we have Roseanne's backup, which can sometimes loop the Hero's Cape, the Defiance Band, or even TM Devolution if the matchup suits, whilst at the same time possibly looping your attacker for the matchup as well. Alessandro, super experienced with the archetype, so it's not surprising to me that they did well, but the fact that he chose to play the Pidgeot build of control rather than Snorlax might speak volumes to this deck's power. Interestingly, Bert, who also made top 8 with the archetype, played an entirely different version, to be honest with you, this time quite heavy on the block Snorlax, slightly heavier on Eerie in the deck as well, and chooses to play Temple of Sinnoh as well as Giacomo to give yourself some percentage into Lugia. Also has the Magma Basin in the deck list to try and have a more aggressive means of Radiant Charizard, to possibly catch the opponent out and start initiating that prize race a little earlier on in the game. A lot of the elements are similar here though, so definitely try out the different tech cards between both lists. Both Future Hand builds were vanquished in top 8 and do have slight differences going on in this one. The most interesting card here to see is Erica's Invitation. I believe the Ericas didn't perform all that well from what I could tell from the Twitter comments, but it does possibly keep you in games in certain situations if your opponent is correctly playing around your damage output or your prize map. This can really unlock the door if all else fails. No real tech cards beyond that. The Double Psych Energy was slowly creeping up in popularity before the tournament. Lost Vacuum's a very reasonable tech card to have in the deck list, and it looks like this list decided to cut stadiums altogether to make space for those couple of tech cards. Yuho, of course, very accustomed to using that Iron Hands EX to its full potential, sticking with a very high count of the Countercatcher, just one copy of Boss's Orders and no Pokegear within his deck list. Did still choose to play one copy of Town Store and had that TM Crisis Punch in the deck, allowing this archetype to reach that high damage threshold, possibly when your opponent isn't expecting it. With the potential of 4 Iron Crown in play, you can actually reach on Charizard in the late game with this archetype, so having Crisis Punch can be an alternative to needing Gust in the late game. The final deck in top 8 was this Roaring Moon Dunsparce archetype. It also made top 16 as well. For a deck that didn't have much representation, is a really fantastic performance. The archetype only plays 23 ancient cards in the deck list, so the Vengeance Fletching is mostly going to be dealing with single prize threats, but might eventually be able to reach into basic EX Pokemon. But it's mostly the Roaring Moon EX that's trying to do the heavy lifting in terms of dealing with V-Star Pokemon and Charizards. The Dunsparce synergizes really nicely in the deck list. You have Artisan to continually return these Dunsparce back into play. They offer a pivot for you to allow you to Dark Patch more effectively, and they're great onboard draw power throughout the game. This is an archetype that I saw in the online tournaments, didn't really commit enough time into before the EUIC because I was already kind of locked into my own deck choice, so it's one that I'm going to be giving a lot more time and respect going into the next few weeks. The other main stories involve Fabian Puyol, who was able to get 9th place, actually bubbled out of cut with a Gardevoir archetype, played a couple really interesting cards, had both the Fluttermane and the Klefki within the list. Also decided to play a copy of Eerie of their own, which I think is super interesting. And in many ways, kind of just put Gardevoir back on the map, putting respect back on its name, that it can still hang with the top decks in format. It still has a heavy Iono presence at its side. It has many great ways of taking out opponents' engine Pokemon with Screamtail, with Drifloon, and it still has Refinement plus Greninja throughout the game. There's still so much to like about the Gardevoir deck, and I will expect it to be picking up in popularity and sort of making a push towards that sort of top 6 or 7 decks in format. A more traditional ancient box also made top 16. This of course won the senior division as well, which is really impressive for an archetype like this. Really streamlining it with the 4 Flutter, 4 Koraidon, 4 Roaring Moon. Really interesting to see just one copy of Fighting Energy in the deck list, but it is accompanied with double Super Rod as well as Superior Energy Retrieval, which did show up in the highest placing Fukuoka Champions League 60 as well. In some ways, the Superior is an A-spec in its own right. It can be another way that you can thin your hand of ancient cards, but also gets back a number of energy to manually attach, but also continue to use your Greninja freely throughout the sort of mid to late game, where this deck can sort of be on fumes at times. Another archetype that's really cool to see, and I think with the very simple ratios of this archetype that we've seen here from Joao, it has a very good chance of establishing itself as, again, a top deck in the format. Pedro was able to make top 16 with Lost Zone Box. He's very accomplished with the archetype and has stuck true with it into this format. Pedro having as many as 5 multi-prize Pokemon in the deck list, having Raikou and Iron Hands for lightning type coverage and potential uptrades, with Ampy very much, Roaring Moon still being that high damage output dealer, Hooper EX helping out against Arceus and to some extent the Future Hands matchup, with Mew EX giving you some extra draw power and protection against Iono, and some surprise attacking threats from that genome hacking, which can come up trumps late game against Charizards, can be solid in mirror matches against Giratina, and even against Gardevoir now, which we again have to respect. Beyond that, Pedro played a pretty straightforward streamlined build of what had already been doing well in the recent build-up with Lost Box. Again, it's a surprise to me at how few people piloted this archetype in the end, but Pedro is a Lost Zone master at this point, so no surprise again to see him in the money with the deck. There was an Arceus Armarouge in top 32, just outside of top 16 actually. The deck gained the new Gouging Fire as an aggressive attacking option, doing 260 base, but you can try and push that with Choice Belt or with Maximum Belt even as well. The Armarouge EX is a very tanky Pokemon. When it has full hit points, it takes 80 less from your opponent's Pokemon, so it can allow you to Scorching Bazooka for a 2-hit KO, knowing that very rarely you're going to be KO'd back. You have the 1-hit KO option of Rad Heatran, you have Delphox for spread pressure. It really is a toolkit style archetype that's very difficult for your opponent to play around everything at once, and you kind of have that star buff to try and stitch things all together with a heavy Iono package on your side. I still think it's a little bit less consistent than Arctina overall, because you're just filling the deck with so many options, but this archetype certainly has more game-winning plays than an Arctina does, so it certainly has that higher power level at its disposal when everything's working. Chien-Pao had a pretty good day 1-2 conversion, and ultimately they didn't end up doing that badly. A lot of them actually missed out on the winning in. Actually played against Tom in day 2. He was the highest placing build. A very straightforward 60 of Chien-Pao, just using to play the extra copy of Bidoof and incorporating a Kyogre, which was kind of interesting. But I think the majority of Chien-Pao aren't too different from the sort of standard shells that we've been seeing over the past few weeks, and I think that will continue to be a threat in the format. It's actually quite encouraging that a number of Charizards have decided to tech for the Snorlax for you, so possibly they're less popular going into the next few weeks, so you might have a clearer run with Chien-Pao in this format going ahead. Like I said, Lugia also lost the winning in. Again, nothing too spectacular about the deck list. It was playing the Luxray plus Reversal combination in the list. The deck also chose to play a full 4 counter Professor's Research and just one of those Serena, with a more traditional counter 3 boss in the 60. There's also that very cheeky Mew EX in the list as well, with that genome hacking, which I'm sure can surprise people in many situations. Espathra Banette with that sort of Xatu draw engine also made it into top 32, which is really cool to see. We've already spoken a little bit about what the Banettes can offer you, but having that Espathra EX can be a frustrating ability for basic attacking lists like Lost Box and Future Hands, whilst the type coverage can be a frustration for that Charizard archetype as well. This again was a deck list that kind of popped up in online tournaments as somewhat of a counter toolbox, and it's cool to see that it could have such a deep run in international championships, even with some wacky cards like Quad Capturing Aroma. There were some other lists in the day 2 of the EUIC, so I do employ to check them out, but to give my voice a rest, I'm just going to touch on my tournament run very quickly. I chose to play a very simple Arctina list where I incorporated 4 copies of Trekking Shoe rather than having additional copies of the likes of Judge, Switch, and cards like Capturing Aroma, which found their way into the 60 in recent times. I thought Trekking Shoes was the most flexible way to improve your odds of getting a turn 1 arc attachment. It also just gave you more general dig throughout the game, certainly against Lost Zone matchups where you don't want to put down Squover, your engine is a lot less busted, you want to have those extra pushes with shoes, and in general the deck has a number of sort of tech cards which are only used in certain matchups, so having a little bit of additional discard alongside your Ultra Balls was welcomed. I finished day 1 with a 6-2-1 record, I beat 2 Snorlax, 2 Pidgeot controls, so I hit some really good matchups. My other 2 wins came against Chempao, which is a tougher one, as well as a Dialga V-Star with Matang. I lost to a mirror match where I went second and had far worse setups in all games. And I also lost to a Charizard on turn 3 of time after whiffing a max belt the previous turn, with a Squovert Barrel plus double Trekking Shoe dig in not that thick of a deck. And my tie in day 1 was to a Moon to Dunsparce, where there's just too many single prizes to get through throughout the entire game. Day 2 didn't quite go to plan. I lost to a Chempao in round 1. I was able to beat Sanders Pidgeot control, which was again affirming that the matchup's very good, which I already knew from the day before. I then tied to another Chempao. The matchup really is tough with only 1 Eerie in the deck list. I would expect a second copy to really improve that, but the entire set was really weird anyway, where a combination of both of us are missing pieces and we're doing scrappy bosses orders passing into one another now and again. I then lost another mirror where once again I went second and once again didn't have the right side of variance, although my opponent did play a choice belt anyway, so I felt I was always behind in the mirror regardless. I then lost to a Zardbit Barrel, which unlike the Pidgeot matchup, I think is actually very much out of your favour. They were really nicely able to checkmate me in both games with the use of their Radzard and having all 1 prize boards to force me down to 1 prize against them, allowing them to have 2 turns back to back of knocking out V-Star Pokemon with the combination of Defiance Banded Radzard into their Charizard EX as their final prize. And then in round 15, I actually lost to another Zard Pidgeot. The matchup's pretty good for me actually, but again, the matchup got super weird. They also played Gouging Fire, which caught me off guard to take 8 energy off my Giratina V-Star in a turn, where they were able to get a Gouging Fire out of nowhere with a Choice Belt plus Countercatcher play. I still ended up actually winning that game, which was bizarre, but we had a really silly set overall, and I wasn't quite able to pull it out. So just a top 256 finish for me. Had a lot of fun though. Like I said, my voice was gone from the Thursday night I went to watch Chelsea beat Man United. I have no regrets whatsoever. And thanks so much for everyone who came up to me, said hello, said nice things about the channel. I really am grateful for everyone for that. It really does inspire me to keep going and putting as much effort into these videos as I do. It looks like I'm going to be falling short for my Worlds invite this year. There aren't many tournaments left for me now. I am planning on going to the NEIC, so maybe that's my last chance saloon to get that invite. Hopefully over the next couple of days my voice will be returning to me so I can do some of these deck profiles of some of the updated deck lists. But for now, hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.